what is it that flips the switch? What takes someone perfectly ordinary, someone you might pass on the street without a second glance, and turns them into someone capable of, well, truly horrific acts?
It's a question that really echoes through history, doesn't it? From wartime atrocities to just inexplicable cruelty between people.
It really does.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of question that keeps you up at night, trying to figure out how that potential for darkness fits within what we think of as normal human behavior.
Absolutely. Which is why today we're really diving deep into this concept called the Lucifer Effect.
Right. And just to be clear, we're not talking like literal demons here. This is a term coined by the psychologist Philip Zimbardo.
Exactly. He uses it to describe how normal folks, people like you and me, essentially, can transform. Yeah. How they can become capable of morally reprehensible actions, but it really depends on the specific situations they find themselves in.
The name itself is powerful, drawing that parallel to Lucifer's fall from grace.
Mm-hmm. That descent from light into darkness. It's a really striking analogy for this psychological phenomenon. It suggests this capacity for, well, moral decline isn't just reserved for a few inherently bad people.
Precisely. So our mission, our goal today, is to really try and unpack this transformation. We're going to start with what's often seen as the genesis of this idea, the Stanford Prison Experiment.
Groundbreaking stuff, hugely controversial, of course, but it really shone a light on how situations can shape us.
Yeah, and we won't stop there. We'll also look at insights from other giants, Stanley Milgram, Albert Bandura, Hannah Arendt, Solomon Asch. Their work helps us grasp these powerful situational forces.
And it's really important to stress this isn't about making excuses for bad behavior. Not at all.
No, definitely not.
It's about understanding the psychological levers, the things that can pull ordinary people down these paths. The hope being, if we understand them, maybe we can recognize and resist them better.
Okay, so let's dig in. Let's start with ground zero, as Zimbardo called it, the Stanford Prison Experiment. So, picture this. It's 1971, Stanford University.
Right. Zimbardo and his team, they recruit these male college students, about 24 of them.
And these weren't just any students, right? They were screened.
That's a really crucial point. They were psychologically evaluated, found to be stable, balanced, healthy individuals. No obvious red flags, according to the tests back then.
Okay. Then, roles were assigned. How?
Literally a coin toss. Completely random. Half became guards, half became prisoners.
And they really committed to the setup, didn't they? The environment.
Oh, absolutely. They set up this simulated prison right in the basement of the psychology department. They went all in.
Tell us about the details, the uniforms, the props.
Well, the guards got these military-style khaki uniforms, which instantly signaled authority. They had billy clubs, clear symbols of power, and importantly, mirrored sunglasses.
Ah, the sunglasses. Why were they so significant?
Okay. They created anonymity. Made eye contact impossible. It fostered this psychological distance, making it easier for the guards to, well, detach from the prisoner's humanity.
And the prisoners, what was their experience like?
They got these ill-fitting smocks, like hospital gowns almost, nylon stocking caps to simulate shaved heads, a classic technique for stripping identity, and they wore ankle chains.
Wow, ankle chains, a constant physical reminder.
Exactly. All these elements, the visual, the symbolic, were designed very deliberately to establish a power dynamic fast and really reinforce those assigned roles.
So what happened next? Because things escalated quickly, didn't they?
Unsettlingly quickly. The experiment was meant to run for 2 full weeks.
But it didn't last that long.
No way. They had to shut it down after just 6 days. It just spiraled out of control.
Could you elaborate on that? How did it escalate so fast?
It was, well, fascinating and disturbing. The participants seemed to just absorb their roles almost immediately. The guards started asserting authority, and it became increasingly cruel, often gratuitously so.
Like what kind of things?
It started small, petty harassments, push-ups as punishment, but it quickly moved to psychological abuse, sleep deprivation, really humiliating tasks, cleaning toilets with bare hands, that kind of thing. Dehumanizing tactics.
And the prisoners, how did they react?
Initially, there was some pushback, a bit of rebellion on day 2, actually. But pretty quickly, many became passive, withdrawn. Some showed signs of severe emotional distress, depression, anxiety.
So they sort of gave in to the role.
Some really did. They started internalizing that prisoner identity. It was a stark, rapid demonstration of how powerfully the situation itself was shaping their psychology, their behavior.
So the big takeaway, the thing Zimbardo has hammered home for decades,
is that the experiment starkly illustrated how power can corrupt, how stressful situations, external rules, even arbitrary ones, and dehumanization can lead good people to act in unexpectedly awful ways.
It really became this foundational, though still debated, piece of evidence for the power of the situation.
Absolutely. Even with all the ethical questions raised later, its impact was huge.
Now, fast forward a few decades. Zimbardo writes his big book in 2007, The Lucifer Effect, understanding how good people turn evil. He takes these ideas further, right?
He does. He moves beyond just the experiment. He applies those core insights to try and understand real-world atrocities. He's looking at everything from, say, corporate crime and malpractice all the way up to genocide.
Taking the micro-level findings from the lab and scaling them up to the macro level of society.
Exactly, using it as a lens. And one really prominent example was his involvement in the Abu Ghraib prison abuse scandal.
Right, he served as an expert witness for one of the soldiers. What was his angle there?
What was notable and quite controversial was that he didn't just blame the individual soldiers, the bad apples.
He pointed higher up.
He argued for systemic failures, the environment in the prison, the lack of clear rules and oversight, the intense stress, the U.S. versus them mentality fostered by the war. He argued that the system, the situation, created conditions where abuse became much more likely. The bad barrel, as he put it.
Didn't he also make some comments about leadership responsibility reaching quite high? Like the White House at the time?
He did. He suggested pretty directly that the policies and rhetoric from the Bush administration helped create a climate conducive to such abuses. That was, understandably, a very contentious point.
So pulling together his broader conclusions from the book, what are the core tenets of the Lucifer Effect, according to Zimbardo?
Okay, so key points are, first, malice isn't necessarily inherent. It can be circumstantial, situational.
Okay.
Second, stressful, ambiguous situations, plus strong external rules and this drive to win or dominate can easily trigger dehumanization.
Us versus them.
Exactly. Third, power corrupts, especially in hierarchical systems, even temporary artificial ones like the experiment.
Makes sense.
And finally, crucially, while everyone is susceptible to these pressures, not everyone succumbs. There's still individual variation, agency, the possibility of resistance. That's vital.
That idea of situational influence, it feels like it has roots in earlier work. You mentioned Zimbardo was inspired by Stanley Milgram.
Yes, Milgram's obedience experiments at Yale in 1961 were a huge influence, predating Stanford by a decade. Milgram wanted to understand obedience to authority. How far would people go?
Remind us of that setup. That's another one that's pretty chilling.
It really is. Participants were recruited as teachers. They were told to administer electric shocks to a learner who was actually an actor for every memory mistake.
But the shocks weren't real.
No, but the teachers absolutely believed they were. And the intensity increased with each error, going up this dial marked with voltage levels, all the way to 450 volts, labeled XXX, potentially lethal.
And the learner wasn't silent.
Oh, no. The actor feigned pain, grunts, shouts, pleaded to stop, mentioned a heart condition, protested vehemently.
Yet, despite all that, the results were
shocking. In the main version, 65%, almost two-thirds of participants went all the way. They administered the maximum 450-volt shocks simply because the experimenter, the authority figure in the lab coat, told them to continue. The experiment requires that you continue. Please continue.
Wow. That level of obedience is staggering.
It truly is. It demonstrated this incredible power of perceived legitimate authority to override personal conscience.
And you mentioned this connects to Hannah Arendt's idea, the banality of evil. How so?
Well, Milgram's findings provide some pretty stark empirical backing for Arendt's concept. It showed ordinary people, not sadists, could inflict what they believed was terrible pain just because they were obeying orders. It suggests evil acts aren't always done by monsters, but sometimes by ordinary people deferring to authority, not thinking critically about what they're actually doing.
Let's unpack Arendt's idea a bit more. The banality of evil. Where did that come from?
Hannah Arendt, a major 20th century political philosopher. The phrase famously came from her reporting on the 1961 trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem.
Eichmann, the Nazi SS officer, key organizer of the Holocaust logistics.
Right. And Arendt went expecting to see a monster. But what struck her profoundly was how ordinary he seemed.
Not demonic, but bureaucrat.
Exactly. Almost bland. She described him as focused on his job, on efficiency, on following orders from the state. The chilling part for her was his apparent inability to grasp the monstrous evil inherent in his actions. He wasn't thinking morally, just operationally.
So banality didn't mean evil is trivial or common?
No, not at all. It meant that great evil can be committed by seemingly unremarkable people, not out of deep-seated malice, but through a kind of thoughtlessness, a failure to engage in critical moral reflection, just following the rules of the system.
It's about how these seemingly small acts, these bureaucratic decisions, add up.
Yes, through processes like dehumanization, thinking of victims as numbers or problems to be solved, and social conformity, just doing what's expected or ordered within that terrible system.
You can really see the lines connecting Zimbardo, Milgram, and Arendt here. They're all grappling with how ordinary people get drawn into committing atrocities under certain conditions. It challenges that simple good versus evil people narrative.
Absolutely. Which then leads to the question, how do people justify this to themselves? If good people do bad things, what's going on psychologically?
And that brings us to Albert Bandura and moral disengagement.
Precisely. Bandura's theory looks at the psychological mechanisms people use to basically switch off their own moral compass temporarily.
How does that work?
The core idea is we have internal moral standards, right? But moral disengagement allows us to violate those standards without feeling bad about ourselves, without damaging our self-concept as a good person. We find ways to rationalize or detach.
Okay, and Bandura identified specific ways we do this, mechanisms.
Yes, he outlined 8 key mechanisms. Should we run through them quickly?
Yeah, let's do that. What's the first one?
Moral justification. Framing harmful acts as serving a higher moral purpose. We had to do X to achieve the greater good of Y.
Okay, justifying the means by the supposed end. Got it.
Second, advantageous comparison. Making your own bad actions seem less awful by comparing them to something even worse. Sure, we did that, but look what they did.
The whataboutism defense. Third, euphemistic labeling. Using sanitized language to mask harsh realities. Calling bombing servicing a target or civilian deaths collateral damage.
Softens the blow, psychologically.
Exactly. Fourth, displacement of responsibility.
Yeah.
Blaming your actions on authority figures. I was just following orders. That's Milgram territory right there.
Clear connection.
Fifth, diffusion of responsibility.
Yeah.
Spreading responsibility across a group so no one feels personally accountable. Everyone was doing it, or I was just a small cog in the machine.
Makes it easier to participate or just stand by.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sixth, distortion of consequences. Minimizing, ignoring, or misconstruing the harm caused. It wasn't really that bad. They're exaggerating.
Denying the impact.
Seventh, dehumanization. This is a really potent one.
Yeah.
Stripping victims of human qualities, seeing them as less than human, as objects, vermin statistics, makes harming them much easier.
Lowers that barrier to cruelty significantly. It really does. And finally, 8th, attribution of blame. Blaming the victims themselves for their suffering. They brought it on themselves. They deserved it.
That's a disturbing list. A whole toolkit for silencing conscience.
It really is. And Bandura noted, like you said earlier, that combining things like diffused responsibility and dehumanization is particularly dangerous. It significantly weakens inhibitions against cruelty.
Okay, so we've got the power of the situation, obedience to authority, the ordinariness of perpetrators, and these ways we justify bad acts. How does Solomon Asch's work on conformity fit in?
Asch's experiments in the 1950s add another crucial layer, the power of the group, of social pressure. Asch came from Gestalt psychology, believing you had to understand acts in their social context.
And his famous experiment involved
lines. That's the one. It seems almost absurdly simple. He'd show participants a standard line, then 3 comparison lines, and ask which one matched. Super easy task.
But there was a twist.
The twist was that most other participants in the room were actually Confederates, actors told to give the wrong answer on purpose on certain trials.
So the real participant is sitting there, seeing clearly which line matches, but hearing everyone else confidently say the wrong answer.
Exactly, a direct conflict between their own senses and the group consensus.
And what happened? Did people stick to their guns?
Surprisingly often, no. On average, participants conformed to the clearly wrong group answer about 37% of the time. When they did the task alone, errors were almost non-existent, like 1% maybe, not 5%. I think I misspoke earlier.
Wow. So nearly 40% of the time, people just went along with the wrong answer because the group did.
Yep. It powerfully showed how social pressure can make us doubt our own judgment, even our own eyes, and conform.
I know Asch was also interested in things like propaganda, especially after World War II. How did this connect?
He was trying to understand how large groups could be swayed, how people come to follow the lead of a few. His work suggested we're more likely to conform if the message comes from a perceived authority, or if the group is unanimous. Dissent, even from one other person, dramatically reduced conformity.
So linking Asch back to the Lucifer effect.
It shows how group pressure, the desire to fit in, to not make waves, can lead us to act against our own judgment, maybe even our own values. If the group is doing something wrong, it's incredibly hard to be the lone voice saying stop.
Right. The pressure to conform can just override individual conscience.
Precisely. It's sobering how all these threads, situation, authority, justification, conformity weave together to paint this picture of how ordinary people can get drawn into harmful behavior.
It really feels like these forces are incredibly powerful. Looking around today, where do you see echoes of the Lucifer effect and these related concepts playing out?
Oh, unfortunately, you can see potential echoes in many areas. Think about military or police contexts, the strong hierarchy, the obedience structures. The potential for us versus them thinking can sometimes lead to excessive force or abuse.
Yeah, the Milgram effect in uniform.
Or in corporate environments. Intense pressure from above, diffusion of responsibility in large teams, maybe using euphemisms for shady practices. It can lead to unethical decisions, fraud, cutting corners on safety.
We've certainly seen scandals that seem to fit that pattern.
And think about online behavior. Anonymity, distance, group dynamics in online mobs. It can facilitate dehumanization and really aggressive behavior, cyberbullying, spreading misinformation. Moral disengagement seems rampant online sometimes.
The lack of immediate consequences and the feeling of being part of a crowd.
Exactly. And also in fanaticism and extremism, strong group conformity, moral justification for violence, dehumanizing the enemy, blaming victims. All these mechanisms seem to be at play in radicalization.
So these aren't just historical experiments. They feel very relevant to challenges we face right now.
Sadly, yes. The dynamics they uncovered seem timeless.
Okay, so if these forces are so pervasive, are we just doomed? Or does this research also offer clues on how to resist? How do we hold the line?
Thankfully, yes, the research does suggest strategies for resistance. Building on Arendt, developing critical thinking is key. Questioning assumptions, questioning authority, thinking for yourself.
Not just blindly accepting things.
Right, and cultivating personal responsibility. Resisting that urge to displace blame or diffuse responsibility. Owning your actions, regardless of orders or what the group is doing.
Easier said than done, but crucial.
Absolutely. Practicing empathy actively is another huge one. Making a conscious effort to see situations from others' perspectives, especially those different from you, directly counters dehumanization.
Trying to maintain that human connection.
Yes. And remembering Asch's findings. Seeking allies. If you have doubts, speak up. Find others who feel the same. Even one dissenting voice can break the spell of conformity for others. Don't underestimate the power of being that voice or supporting it.
There's strength in numbers, even small numbers.
Definitely. Also, proactively establishing clear ethical boundaries for yourself. Knowing your non-negotiables before you're in a high-pressure situation can provide a vital anchor. What lines will you absolutely not cross?
Having that internal compass set beforehand.
Exactly. And finally, just being better at recognizing risk situations. Being aware when you're in a context with strong authority, intense group pressure, or where dehumanization is occurring. That awareness itself is the first step to resisting.
So it's about awareness, conscious effort, and maybe finding courage in connection with others.
I think that sums it up well. It requires active engagement of our better selves.
So wrapping this all up, this deep dive, it really drives home a powerful, maybe uncomfortable message, doesn't it?
It really does, that the capacity for what we call evil isn't confined to some monstrous other. It seems to be a potential within the human condition, one that can be activated in ordinary people under the wrong circumstances.
But again, understanding these influences, it's not about excusing the inexcusable.
Not at all. It's about gaining the knowledge, the tools, to recognize these pressures in ourselves and in society, and hopefully to build resilience against them, to resist being pulled down those paths.
It really becomes a call to action, doesn't it? To think about how we structure our institutions, our societies. Do they foster responsibility, empathy, critical thought? Or do they inadvertently create bad barrel?
Precisely. We need systems that act as safeguards, that encourage individual accountability and ethical reflection.
Zimbardo himself often reminds us that moral progress isn't inevitable.
No, it requires constant vigilance, a constant commitment to basic human values, precisely because these situational forces that can unleash our darker impulses are always potentially present.
It definitely leaves you, the listener, with a lot to think about regarding your own potential, your own resilience and the importance of these safeguards, both personal and societal.
It really does. It encourages that ongoing question. What situations might test my limits, and what am I doing proactively to strengthen my ability to act according to my values when things get tough?